USA Today recently published a story in which we learned that nuns now make up 15% of the population. What are nuns? Well, those are the people that, when asked for their religious affiliation, gave the answer none. That's nearly doubled from the same statistic in 1990. Joining us in studio once again is Ravi Zacharias. Ravi, good to see you again.
Nice to be back, Bob. I've been on the road for 4 weeks, so it's nice to be home.
As an evangelist, the number of people saying they have no religious affiliation must be disturbing.
It is, and I've heard that category, and I think at one stage Richard Dawkins had wanted to call them the brights. Maybe he still does, those who are openly in the positive vein of anti-theism or atheism. He wants to call them brights, which means the others are the not-so-brights. That's the category. But it's interesting. It'd be very interesting to have a few of them around a table, like Dawkins himself, when really pushed, will boil down to an agnostic position, because he cannot have an absolute atheist position. So nuns, there may be a wide category. Some like saying, I'm not into organized religion, I do have personal faith. Or the other alternative is that they do have a religion, and that's self-worship, a different brand of pantheism. So it's fascinating. It's sort of, quote, the coming out of the closet days, because they were looking for a beacon to be their head, and Dawkins now serves that purpose. But it is a very fascinating and a telling sign. I'm not quite sure whether they would all be to the same degree, but it does tell you they're not into any formal organized faith of any kind.
The USA Today article quoted a man by the name of Barry Cosman, who was a co-researcher of the 2008 American Religious Identification Survey. And in that article, he was quoted as saying, "Don't blame secularism for driving up the percentage. These people aren't secularized. They're not thinking about religion and rejecting it. They're not thinking about it at all." In a country where religion is so public, how do you explain that?
He's kind of equivocating on the term, what does he mean, don't blame secularism? The very word seculum in the Latin literally means this worldly. That's what it actually means, that there is no world beyond, there is no outside input. And so when he's saying don't blame secularism, I don't know whether he's saying that ideology has not been the one that's driven them to this, but that's what secularism is. It ends up with the fact that there is no ultimate, infinite, personal God. This world is all that there is to it, to use the scientific term, a closed system. What he's really saying is they have no interest in the transcendent or in the sacred. They are living by it. The blame, that is a completely different. So he's actually fusing two questions into one. It may be, I think the world has changed since 9/11 in many ways. Not just socially, not just economically, not just interculturally. It has changed in terms of people's view of religion as a whole. And sometimes they lump all religions into one and say these guys are bent on destroying civilization as we know it. They never give a fair test to atheism at the same time. But the fact of the matter is, what he is concluding is that there are many, many people who are not interested in a structured form of religion anymore.
So they're not necessarily rejecting God or not thinking about him. It's the institution they're not happy with.
No, and it's interesting, just as I left home this morning before coming here, I've been gone for 4 weeks. On my desk, I saw the latest Newsweek issue. And the headline, I haven't read it, it's by Andrew Sullivan. It said something about to forget God but follow Jesus. So I don't know what his take is on it, interestingly coming from him. But again, it seems to be this bifurcation. Somewhere in the 80s, Bob, I began to get a sense that the more religion became commercialized, the more we were going to flirt with making it a target that would be attacked, because we marketed it rather than proclaiming it. And any time it invades in the political arena or the commercial arena, there will always be those who question the integrity of its message. So I'm not sure that the numbers would follow the same way if they said, what do you think of Jesus Christ, as they would, what do you think of organized religion? I think the people see it in two different ways, and quite legitimately sometimes.
That's a bit more hopeful outlook. I think of Pascal, who wrote that we all have this God-shaped hole in our being and only God can fill it. if indeed you have that many people and that increasing number of people walking around, they must be unhappy and unfulfilled in life, aren't they?
You know, in the last trip, I covered 4 stops. I was in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Thailand, and in Hawaii. In Hong Kong, I was speaking to the YPOs, the Young Presidents Organization, and in Hawaii at the State Prayer Breakfast. The State Prayer Breakfast drew over 2,000. The 2 nights before that, University of Hawaii, which was an overflow crowd. I began this trip one day before I began the trip at Clemson, nearly 9,000 or something, the largest attendance outside of a sporting event. And the attendance of the prayer breakfast, the fascinating thing is people are hungry. There is no doubt about it. Anybody who thinks there's no hunger is just not revealing the facts as they actually are. So Pascal is right. There is a God-shaped vacuum. But with these tremendous attacks from a rabid secularism, a kind of an attractive spirituality without God, the collapse economically, the geopolitical maneuverings in the name of religion, all of these have had a role to play in disillusioning people. But somewhere in the deep recesses of our own thinking, we don't like the feeling of being left alone. None of us does. And we want a voice from somewhere. And the least they are saying in coming to these meetings is there legitimacy to this? You please tell us. The fact is that the mainstream of humanity will not be affected by things like this. The number of bellmen in the hotel we were staying in Hawaii, the number of taxi drivers who talked to me, they all are searching. They will all talk to you about what this means. It is the elite in certain segments of society, politics, entertainment, and the academy, who seem to be heard the loudest, but they are not necessarily voicing what the undertow is for the mainstream of humanity. There's an incredible hunger. They've lost confidence in political leadership, and who can blame them? The shenanigans that go on in political leadership today, and the nonsense that sometimes goes on in religious leadership as well. But then you come to Good Friday, and then you come to Easter, and you see the tens of thousands all over that have a remarkable expression. Speak, we're listening. They really want to hear. One man at the University of Hawaii who was an atheist came up to me afterwards, and he said, the only thing that bothered me tonight is that you didn't do a Q&A. And I said, I wanted to, but the organizers said they're not taking the auditorium long enough. It is just for the talk. What was he saying? I want to interact with you on these things. So it's a partial glimpse, I think, Bob, and when it's made to look like this is the homogeneous expression of mankind, it's just not fair and it's just not true.
One of the first messages we aired on Let My People Think years ago was your classic message, A Nation in Decay. And we've aired it several times now. And in that message, you raised 4 points about the fall of Judah: evil influence, unconscious decadence, willful negligence, and ungodly impudence. Do these findings on America's spirituality suggest that our decline is speeding up?
It seems that way. That's a very old message, probably sometime in the 80s. I haven't repeated that one for some reason. Maybe because of our culture, you come out with something like that and they'll think, oh, here comes the revivalist or something like that. But if you take all of those points from the evil influence, the willful negligence, and ultimately to the ungodly impudence side of it, we are. And I think, I don't know who it was I was talking to yesterday, to a very senior official of one of the big companies in our nation today, a very godly man, but a man who sees the challenge in the corporate structures today. And I said to him, the Tower of Babel is being rebuilt in front of our own eyes. And this time it's not out of concrete, it's electronically done. It's done in the airways. We're all speaking the same language. And you run the risk and the ire of the media if you critique the media, question the media, and you ask them why it is they are so distorted in the way they do things. I think all the way from the political landscape down to our academics, we're spreading a lot of lies, a lot of untruths. We know how to manipulate emotions. I don't know how many times I have to ask people, do you know that to be true? Or are you just saying it? Do you really know that to be true? The battle of distorted stories, distorted facts, distorted implications. People are dispensing information that is absolutely unverified, editing tapes while putting them on the air. And this guy, Malcolm Muggeridge warned of this. He was in the media. He told us that the lie is stuck like a fishbone in the throat of the microphone. Alexander Solzhenitsyn warned us of this a generation ago, that this is what we're going to see. And of all places now, America, I think, is playing the lead in this. Right from the battles we are fighting politically to the battles we are fighting academically. And then the courtesy of people like Richard Dawkins and all with their huge marches and all of that. We are flirting with the total decimation of a culture. Total decimation of a culture. And I don't think we realize how sad it is and how serious it is.
I'd like to ask you about an event Richard Dawkins spoke at in Washington, D.C. in March. It was called the Rally for Reason, and 10,000 people showed up. Dawkins actually told the crowd to mock religious people. He said, mock them, ridicule them in public. Their beliefs are insane, therefore they should be ridiculed with contempt. It appears as if he's doing exactly what was talked about in Hosea.
He is really complimenting this society of Christians by saying things like that, because he can say it with impunity. I dare him to go to Saudi and do that. I dare him to go to Iran and do that. The least he will find out is that not all religions are created equal. So to make a statement like that, he reminded me of two other things. I remember as a youngster, I think I mentioned it in one of my books, I was in the city of Nagpur. I was in my 20s or early 30s preaching, and I saw a crowd gathering. And I wondered what was going on, and people were laughing and slapping each other on the back. I gathered around I thought some magician was doing his tricks. It was an insane man. It was a man who was unclothed, literally with stones and stuff, scratching himself, dancing, behaving in a sad way. And I remember my eyes filling up with tears, and I thought to myself, is this really some form of entertainment, to laugh at a madman? If he's telling us our ideas are insane, what does mocking do? If it's an insane idea, what does mocking really do? But there's something deeper with what he is doing philosophically. Two things. Number one is this. He goes on in endorsing a most recent book that has been written, that we now have the answer how something can come from nothing. And it's this age-old rehashed quantum vacuum that out of which pops up some kind of particle that, can explain the existence. First of all, it's a misuse of what a quantum vacuum is. No quantum theorist actually tells you that a quantum vacuum is nothing. It's not no thing. There is a pattern. There is the subatomic activity that is going on. So it's not nothing. But suppose it is nothing, meaning no thing whatsoever. What does that do to atheism? I thought atheism's entire definition was everything that is matter. It is a materialistic framework from start to finish. But if the starting point is nothing, then it's not a materialistic framework, it's nothing. And if you're starting from nothing to explain everything, then why not end up in nothing, including meaning? So who's to be mocked here? He's the one who wants to talk about the wonder of beauty and all of this coming out of nothing. That's the insane idea then. That's the thing that needs to be mocked. He's making something out of nothing, making it appear to be nothing, out of which he wants to build everything. It violates the very fundamental starting point of atheism. So even if he is taken practically, I dare him to do it in a counter-perspective like Islam. If he is doing it equivocatingly, then it is not nothing, it is something. If he's mocking something insane, then the insanity actually lies on the side of the mocker. Everything he calls for there violates reason, but this shows you who Dawkins is. He is driven by hate. And that's why many respected atheists want to separate themselves from him. Even secular thinkers took issue with that statement of his and called him to task on it. Dawkins is an angry man, and one day that anger will catch up with him. In a world of civility, you do not mock a counter-perspective. You dialogue with a counter-perspective. You mock a counter-perspective, you provoke the baser instincts in a human being, and somebody violent out there will want to get even with a comment like that. He's playing a very dangerous game.
I was reading an email this morning from one of our Let My People Think listeners to you, pointing out that when they present the gospel to atheists, as they put it, they're attacked by a pack of vicious, rabid dogs. So it's already happening. So what would you recommend to people who find themselves in a position where atheists are mocking them in this way?
Yeah, once upon a time, all of my answers would be very ironic, very warm, very cordial. The older you get, you tend to react, and I'm not sure it's the wisest way. I also have to back down some time and saying, is this really a shouting match? What is the end in sight we desire? Are we desiring the winning of the person or the decimation of the person? We are seeking the winning of the person. Let me give you an example of this. I may have used this at some time. I was speaking at the University of Malaysia, or I think it's called Malaya. It's the oldest Islamic university in Malaysia. And a professor of geology, he's a Christian gentleman, came to me, and he told me this story. I wish I could remember his name. It's something like Gentle Lee or something like that. Very fine man. I'm talking several years ago. He took me out for dinner. He said Ahmed Deedat, the Muslim debater who's passed away from Durban, South Africa, who was taking on all comers, he came to speak at that university, and he mocked the Christian there. And this gentleman stood up and he said, why are you mocking Christianity? And the man said, because it's a farce. He said, nobody can live the Sermon on the Mount. So Professor Lee said to him, why do you say that? He said, come on up here. So Professor Lee walked up to the front, and the man slapped him across the face. Ahmad Deedat slapped him across the face. He said, turn the other cheek now. And Professor Lee told me, he said, Ravi, my face was ringing with that slap. And I turned the other cheek to him. He said, Deedat didn't know what to do. The audience was packed. He said, all right, I won't go that route. But the Bible also says if a man asks you for your tunic, give me your cloak also, whatever. He said, take your trousers off for me. And Professor Lee told me this himself. He said, I looked at the audience, many of my students in there. I said, please forgive me for doing this. And he took his trousers off and was standing in front of the audience in his underwear. And Deedat was just mocking and laughing at him. And then he picked up his clothes, walked out of there. He said, Ravi, my office was lined up with Muslim students the next day, begging for forgiveness for what was done to me. And this kind of nonsense that Dawkins is propagating is exactly the kind of stuff has been tried. It's nothing new. And you really end up looking foolish when you mock somebody's faith like that. There are many beliefs in the world I do not agree with. But if I were to encourage people to mock the person the way he is calling for it, here's the point. In the Christian faith, there's an egalitarianism of people and an elitism of ideas. People are equal. Ideas are unequal. Let ideas be pit against each other, but don't take away the egalitarianism of the person. Don't rob the person of his dignity or her dignity. Take the idea, take it to its logical outworking. That's not mocking it. That's reasonably interacting with it. But if you're mocking an idea, you really don't mock an idea. You mock a person. Because the idea doesn't care if it's being ridiculed. The person does care. And I think Dawkins is on a wrong track, and I think sooner or later he'll take a back step and try to recast this in exactly what he means. But the true ideas that he has really are to mock people and denigrate them. This from a man who studied in an institution where the motto was, who taught an institution where the Lord is my light. And if they had mocked him, they would never even have given him the position to teach. He ought to return the compliment by showing respect for people who disagree with him. In a world of hate, mockery will engender more hate. And if that's the world he wants, that then tells you what his brand of atheism actually is.
One outspoken Christian who's bound to get a lot of this ridicule is NFL quarterback Tim Tebow. He's recently traded from the Denver Broncos to the New York Jets. And as one Washington Post writer pointed out, that's like dropping a Christian amongst the lions because of the nature of New York. Funny comment, but probably not too far from being false. I know you work a lot with professional athletes. What would you advise Tim Tebow and what he's about to face there in New York?
Here, I think, is the point we want to make. If a man or woman has the liberty and the desire to propagate what they believe, interact with them on it. Let them have that freedom to do it. I can assure you, when Muhammad Ali finished his fights and wanted to thank Allah for for his victory and so on, there'd not be too many people who'd want to take Muhammad Ali on, even at his peak. So here's a young man. I think I met him, by the way, years ago. I was speaking at a church. I was not following I don't follow college football that much. You go for the scores, even the NFL. But I saw him, and I saw him share his testimony, and recently drew a few 10,000 or something at an Easter thing. I pray for him. I thank God for him. He's got courage. He's got convictions. Whether he spends sleepless nights over it, I don't know. But all power to him. And throwing him in that den of the New York arena, he's made of big stuff. And I hope he will succeed. My most important concern for him is that he will remain faithful in his life and in his conduct because if he stumbles, the fodder for the media will be exactly what they're looking for. They celebrate people who have lived duplicitous lives and then give $5 million rings to their wives to make up for all the nonsense and the shenanigans. And here's a man who's standing for values. That tells you where their values are coming from. That alone tells you something is radically wrong when you celebrate that which is deviant and mock that which seeks to be honoring to the family and to truth and to culture and most of all to God.
While culture affirms your right to believe what you want, it is increasingly uncomfortable with some beliefs that are considered unacceptable. And more we hear Christians labeled as intolerant. And with us in studio today is Ravi Zacharias. Hello, Ravi.
It's always good to be with you, Bob.
It seems like here in the States, you can't pick up a newspaper without seeing someone accuse someone else of being intolerant. And interestingly, that charge is generally coming from secularists. Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, it's the buzzword. You know, I remember on the heels of the Cultural Revolution, 60s and 70s, when we were trying to coin new words for new behavior or justifying certain types of behavior, all of a sudden there was new coinage for language. Things that were once described in one way were then described in another way. The vocabulary was changing. Terms like values, clarification, both of which were undefined but had an ideological bent, and things like hate speech. And, instead of free speech, then you all of a sudden came out with hate speech. So tolerance really became the word for the new relativistic base for your choices, and anyone who posted an absolute into the discussion was considered intolerant. So it was the absolutization of a relativistic ethic, meaning anything goes so long as you're okay with it, relativize it to yourself, and if in the open marketplace of ideas somebody questions you, then they're intolerant. That's the way it came about, and many books were written on the subject. One has to be very careful. all kinds of dictionaries were developed as to what forms of intolerance were taking place. Even things like lookism, you can't look at a person in a strange way when they say something. One of the campuses was dealing with that word. So not only can you not say anything, you can't even look in a certain way. And if people in the East, we speak with our faces and with our hands, that's basically telling us to turn our backs to their conversation so we don't offend anybody.
And put you in a straitjacket.
That's right, or a mask.
Yeah, there you go. D.A. Carson recently wrote a book on this topic, and we're going to be talking about that book in this discussion today. And the book is called The Intolerance of Tolerance. And he said that when he goes to college campuses, he's often asked to speak on this topic. He points out that the definition has changed over the years, where tolerance used to mean, I believe what I want, you believe what you believe, and I respect your right to believe that, but I don't necessarily have to agree with it. Now you'll find dictionaries that will say, and let me quote it, acceptance of different views. That's a subtle change, but it means a lot, doesn't it?
Yes, and of course, as he goes to show how the dictionaries themselves redefine this term, which tells you how impossible it is to be neutral for some people, even though they want you to be neutral. They are already stacking the deck in their favor. But I think I would go one step beyond even what Don Carson has gone. In the dictionary, while they go to acceptance, I think in society, they want you not just to accept, but to endorse and celebrate. So, even acceptance can be nuanced, saying, well, what do? I have to accept this reality. But they mean more than that. They mean to accept it as quite normative and not make value judgments on it. And the one step beyond that is not just to accept it and not make value judgments, but come out with a value judgment saying this is a good thing. So that, I think, is where we're headed. It's tough, Bob. I have to be so careful as a public speaker. I remember speaking at a conference recently, and I had no intention of even nuancing the word, but I talked about how we go about life with gay abandon, and that's, of course, an old phrase that you use. And after I said, oh, brother, somebody's going to think I'm talking about an alternate lifestyle sexually, so that's not the intention at all. But you have to be very careful how you even use words. And this is, I like to put it this way. Everybody may have a right to what they believe, but that does not mean everything they believe is right. And in the free marketplace of ideas, we ought to be able to, with willingness, entertain alternative views and not do that with being disagreeable at the same time.
Well, Ravi, the ramifications for the Christian are severe. How in the world does the Christian present the gospel as truth in an environment where any claim to knowing the truth is seen as gross intolerance?
It's a great question, Bob. And, the Bible says, can an Ethiopian change his skin and a leopard its spots? I can't change my skin. I come from where I come from. I was born and raised in India. And very fascinating. If you go to India or being raised in India, nobody stands up there and apologizes that there's a Hindu substructure to the culture, our culture in India. There are views that are taught from the class by professors. You expect him or her to say the things they do. And you don't sit there sort of saying, I don't like what he's saying. I'm going to question him because I don't believe the same thing. But out in the West, that's really what's happened in reverse. The Judeo-Christian worldview framed how we came to be where we are today, the ethical belief system, the substructure of free speech, the intrinsic value of human life. Those are all really Christian ethics based on that. There's no other transcendent worldview that lends itself to these ramifications. But here we are now. We are a worldview that made all these benefits of discussion possible is now evicted from the arena. The very universities that were founded by people who were followers of Jesus Christ are now people who are not allowed to say the things that they were once upon a time allowed to say. So when I go into a public arena and speak, my goodness, you have to, it's walking on eggshells. You have to be very wise. Now, if people do go to another extreme and lash out, I think unwisely and foolishly, it's not necessary. But in the marketplace of ideas and discussion and disagreement, if you're not allowed to say what you believe and why you believe, how are you ever going to put it to the test of truth? So that's the thing. truth has now been neutered. And I remember in the 60s reading what Adlai Stevenson had once said. He said, what we need is a new word in the English dictionary. That word is yo. It neither means yes nor no. So that illusion of neutrality is what we think we are living under, and that is absolutely not so. It is neutral to the one who wants to foist his or her worldview. It's a one-edged sword. Lop off the opposition, keep a blunt edge towards yourself.
Berger's plausibility structure raises another problem for evangelicals and apologists as yourself. How do you change the culture if you're seen as intolerant and as a result nothing that you say is seen as valuable?
In reality, Bob, these things have been battled in different ways before. How did a Wilberforce change the culture of the plausibility of slavery? How did John Newton come out of something like that and battle against it? How did Martin Luther King rail against the horrific practice of racial prejudice and so on? Reformers will come on the scene. These kinds of soils make it ready-made for reformers. G.K. Chesterton made the comment that tolerance is really the creed of a person who doesn't believe anything. And in many ways, that's what is supposedly happening. So the first thing I think is somebody will emerge. I think the second thing is I still have confidence in our youth, even though they may be a minority. Just recently, I was speaking to an audience of 500 young people. Wonderful how they were engaging the ideas, nodding their heads and taking it on. I think these things will change one person at a time. And that's the way when Christ came on, when Jesus came into the scene in the incarnation, his whole message was not tolerated. How did he do it? Won them one person at a time, and ultimately after the collapse of Rome and Christendom taking over the world, the history of the world changed. But I think it's going to be a steep climb.
Sadly, Christians have said things that have helped push this definition of intolerance, this new definition of tolerance, and we can unfortunately quote some people who've said things like this. And Carson in his book quotes a couple of well-known Christians and things that they've said publicly, and let me read them and have you respond to them. We won't name these people, but this has been said in public. One is, you say you're supposed to be nice to the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians and the Methodists and this and that and the other thing. Nonsense. I don't have to be nice to the spirit of the Antichrist. I can love the people who have false opinions, but I don't have to be nice to them. And then another comment from another person that we'll leave unnamed was, I want hatred to wash over you. Yes, hate is good. Our goal is a Christian nation. We have a biblical duty. We're called by God to conquer this country. We don't want equal time. We don't want pluralism. These comments make us cringe, but I guess as Christians we are supposed to hate evil, aren't we?
And I think we as Christians who are defending the truth and the faith ought to speak out against this kind of thing as well. The old adage, which I've quoted quite often, my mother used to say, once you've cut off a person's nose, don't give them a rose to smell. What is the object of the Christian faith? Is it to devastate the person or to win the person? That's the question. If you are there to just lash out and flay them, and some apologists historically have done that. No, I think the ultimate ethic and the greatest ethic is love. Who, while we were yet sinners, sent his Son, who loves us in spite of the fact that we are unlovable. It is fascinating to me how the Lord handled two of the most broken lives in the New Testament. The woman of Samaria, how he gently peeled the layer away, and it is fascinating what she says, come and see the one who knew everything about me. And what is unsaid there is, and he didn't cut me down at the knees. What she says is, Messiah has probably come. Come and see that one. And then the woman who comes with the alabaster ointment. Interesting. I think if a legalist were there to just say, where do you get this from? What kind of money did you use for this? Jesus never even said that. He paid her the greatest compliment in the scriptures, that wherever the gospel of his message was going to be told, so was also what this woman had done in her act of worship. And And by loving somebody and giving them the opportunity to sense that love, you actually conquer. Not only in the ends, you also conquer with the right means. Almost every Muslim that I know has come to Christ has come either through visions or dreams or because they've seen the love of Jesus. This kind of vitriolic language is nothing more than pride masquerading as righteousness.
How do you recommend a Christian speak his or her values without being vitriolic?
Sometimes we stumble, we fail. Many times after an open forum, I come back and I say, I shouldn't have said it that way. It's not right. But the fact of the matter is, it is possible. I have received scores of letters over the years from people who disagreed with us and say, hey, we disagree, but thanks for giving me a hearing and representing my view the way you did. I'm grateful for that. Many of them will ultimately come over. A classic example of this is the modern-day writer Matthew Paris from England. You know, here was a man once upon a time hostile, anti-Christian, anti-theistic, all of it. All of a sudden he goes to the land where he was raised in Malawi and sees the genuine beauty of Christ in some of the missionaries, and he says, I catch myself saying, this is what all Africa needs. And now he's writing to the Christian to be careful not to be befriended too much by the secular elite, because they will rob you of the substance of what you actually believe. So it can be done, and they do come back one at a time. But it's a discipline, a very strong discipline, to bite the lip and bite the tongue and not say exactly what you're feeling. But if the object is to communicate the gospel, then the ends alone are not good enough. The means are important too.
Zeroing in on this definition of tolerance, it's really inconsistent, isn't it, this new definition?
It is, just as relativism is inconsistent, and that's the metaphysical base. What does relativism really say? Yeah, I know it sounds philosophically sophisticated, but what does relativism really say? All truth is relative. Relative to whom or to what? Is it relative to yourself? Is it relative to the circumstance? Is it relative to a culture? Relativism is kind of a notion unhinged from everything. You have to, Chesterton's comment, you know, when you open your mouth, the point is to close it on something. So why is it inconsistent? Because the starting point is inconsistent. A little bit like an aircraft, if your calibrations are slightly off the mark on the ground, the higher the altitude, the greater the divergence from what the actual reality is. So it is inconsistent. If it tells me that I should learn to be tolerant of a counter perspective, but then does not give me the same prerogative to voice my belief as they give themselves, it is radically contradictory. I think Carson points this out in his book, or Guinness so brilliantly points this out. Notice, for example, something like this. When the media reports something terrible that a jihadist has done, you know, they'll talk about it as a Muslim extremist. When this man on a fringe end of Christianity wanted to burn the Quran in Florida, he was described as, a Baptist minister or a Christian minister? Why wasn't he described by the media as kind of an extremist fringe guy who is just up to some kind of mischief? Well, and if an evangelical is described with something, if they use the term fundamentalist, it's pejoratively used. But if it's used of an extremist in the Islamic world, it is to accommodate and celebrate the rest of them. Thou speakest with a forked tongue. I'm afraid that's the way it comes out, yeah.
What do you see happening to Western culture if this new definition of tolerance remains?
The only thing I would say is we ought not to get too pessimistic about it, because at the same time we're seeing some unbelievable things happening. You know, even as I'm speaking to you, thinking of heading on to Clemson in 3 or 4 days, and they're talking about anywhere between 7,000 to 10,000 showing up for the event. Why are they showing up? John Lennox, our colleague, was in Harvard recently, standing room only. Did a faculty forum, 135 faculty come to hear him. I was just talking to someone who said that he was speaking at Stanford, standing room only. So also at Princeton, so also I think at Duke. Students are searching. They know the emperor has no clothes in these worldviews. And so I believe, even though we may go down for a little while, we may emerge from this. The biggest danger I see is if we fail to understand the other transcendent worldviews who can leverage this time of lack of solidity and build a platform of their own. To unbuild that platform could take generations. So it is not secularism I fear, it is a transcendent worldview of a different order that I think could really sabotage the future here.
As we record this whole topic of the role of religion in public life is really taking hold in Great Britain. They're debating this in their parliament, and a lot of discussion in the newspapers as well about this. And one minister made the comment that this militant secularism, as he put it, was challenging the religious foundations of British society. Do you agree with him?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's been going on. It's been going on for quite a while. And I think that the danger in Europe is a little bit different, the way it came about to the danger here. The danger there was, I think, the moment religion became politicized as a state religion, I think they were already sowing the seeds for hostility and antagonism towards it. Nobody wants to be forcibly taxed to pay for your church buildings and this kind of stuff, and to be forced to believe certain things. But here there's a gradual leaning towards a state atheism coming in both in Britain and here. I agree with him. And, the interesting thing is the allies on the Christian side are now coming out of the woodwork from other worldviews that believe in God. And just think, for example, if you really listen to a Richard Dawkins or somebody from out there talking about atheism, holding children's camps and stuff like this, writing children's books, it is to implant in them very early that hostility. This from a man who taught at a university, the motto of which is "The Lord is my light." If we had practiced the same method in employing him that he is practicing now in talking about the worldview that built the institution that gave him a job, what would have happened? He would never have got a job in those institutions. But this is par for the course, Bob. I remember when I was doing my theological training, I read scores of liberal scholars. Sometimes we were reading more from the hostile side than the defense side. But if you go into a liberal seminary and ask them if they've ever studied people like Warfield or Machen or modern-day writers like Sproul and so on, or N.T. Wright, and they don't know who you're talking about. So it's truly an indoctrination without a real understanding of a counter perspective. So I think Britain and all are paying this price now, and it's sad to see it happen.
Another minister made another comment in the Daily Mail that really affects us because we're seeing it here as well. And here's what he said. He said, "We've seen men and women disciplined for wearing modest symbols of Christian faith at work, and we've seen legal challenges to councils opening their proceedings with prayer, a tradition that goes back generations, brings comfort to many, and hurts no one." His comment seems to suggest that this new definition of tolerance actually breeds extremism.
Yes, it does. I'm a little hesitant about saying this, but somebody very significant said to me when I was the chairman of the National Day of Prayer, and I was right in the White House. He looked me in the eye and he said, "You may be the last one here for some time." I said, "Wow." He said, "Yeah, you may be the last one here for some time." And that happened in the last two to three National Days of Prayer. The chairperson has not been welcomed into the White House. There's been no White House prayer that has been held. And because, of course, they may lay claim to the fact that it's making it a state religion. But for history, going back several presidents, both Republican and Democratic, both of them welcomed that. Both sides of the aisle welcomed it. But what's happened now, this stridency that has come about, and of course the hostility of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which I think is none of the above, somehow makes it intimidating for you to even lead in prayer. But it's interesting, just a few days ago when there was a shooting in one of our schools, all the kids gathered together in a classroom to do what? To pray. When you run into a crisis, they can't legislate at that point. You don't pray. Whether it was Virginia Tech when it happened or wherever these things take place, it is a sad reality of incoherence and inconsistency and the debunking of the only worldview that justified the formation of a nation like this.
Well, I can't let you get away without asking this last question about a recent conference at Oxford. And they were talking about this very topic, the role of religion in public life. On that panel was Richard Dawkins, who you just quoted, a man who's often called the most well-known atheist in the world. And he made this comment. He said, "I cannot be sure that God does not exist." What do you make of that?
Not much, too much, actually. And I'll tell you why. He's smart. In order to say he's 100% sure, he would have to act as God. He would have to claim infinite knowledge. So I think somewhere in that same thing he went on to say he's 99.9% sure or something like that. I remember what Winston Churchill said once of his nemesis who just lashed out at him. Churchill just listened carefully, then leaned over to the person sitting next to him and said, "There, but for the grace of God, goes God." And I think Richard Dawkins knows there's a logical fallacy in saying I'm 100% sure. To posit an absolute negation, you would have to have unlimited knowledge. But that's the very entity you're denying actually exists, anybody with unlimited knowledge. So he just gives himself a little caveat and says 99.9. So then I think in that conversation, maybe the Archbishop said to him, "Then why don't you call yourself an agnostic?" And he said, I would say that. But, a genuine agnostic is one who's willing to pursue the evidence. You can't have a hard-nosed agnostic, which is tantamount to anti-theism. So, but, I'll tell you what, when you see the changes of attitude in a Matthew Paris and an A.N. Wilson and Anthony Flew in the senior years of their life, maybe it shows there's still hope. Maybe when Dawkins reaches his 80s or so, he may say, like Manasseh of old, I was wrong and made the mistake. So we should never stop praying for people like that.